Heavy fighting between Israel and Hamas militants enters its second week. At least 212 people have been killed in Gaza, 1,400 injured. 61 children, 36 women are among the dead there. Meanwhile, 10 people have been killed in Israel, including 2 children. Already more than 3,200 rockets have been fired from Gaza towards Israeli cities. That's as many in 1 week as what was fired in 50 days when the two sides last fought in 2014. And the fighting is showing few signs of easing. Joseph Fetterman of the Associated Press has more.
We are now in the second week of very heavy fighting, and we see no signs of anything slowing down. We saw another day of Israel just pounding the Gaza Strip with airstrike after airstrike, nonstop rocket fire coming out of Gaza toward Israeli cities. We don't see that slowing down. Israel focused most of its attacks today on Hamas infrastructure, on targets like buildings, homes of militant leaders, and especially on Hamas's underground tunnels. What we also see, the diplomatic angle, no progress, no obvious progress at least, in terms of bringing this to an end. The U.S. Secretary of State says they'd like to see a ceasefire, but as of now there are no signs that the U.S. is putting any pressure on Israel, on its close ally, to stop the fighting. And not too long ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel said he has ordered his troops to keep on fighting, to keep pushing forward. Israel and Hamas have fought 3 wars since 2007 when Hamas took over Gaza, so there are deep underlying issues here. But what we've seen, a few things have changed this time around. First of all, the intensity of the fighting. In 2014, we had a 50-day war. Here we are just 1 week into the fighting, and we've seen almost the same number of rockets and airstrikes already just in 1 week. So it's a very intense war this time around. The second thing is, for the first time ever, we've seen Israeli-Palestinian fighting spill over into Israel proper. So now we have seen violence, mob violence, and so forth between Jewish and Arab mobs inside Israel. That is a disturbing trend, I think, from Israel's perspective. It's something it's never had to deal with before, and it's something that's probably going to linger even after the fighting ends.
Meanwhile, hundreds of Palestinian families have been forced from their homes in the Gaza Strip, with many taking shelter in schools and living in difficult conditions. Noor Hawazin has more on that from Gaza.
The Gaza Strip is now in its 7th day of fierce fighting between Israel and Hamas militants. It's a week which has seen huge damage to buildings and vital infrastructure in Gaza, but many family homes have also been destroyed. Some estimates suggest 770 houses are now uninhabitable. Those families are now being sheltered at UN sites in the center of Gaza City. Many families from the border with Israel have also been moved there too, as fears of a ground invasion grow.
I was sitting in my house with my wife and children, and suddenly there was random shelling by Israeli tanks. We spent that night embracing our children out of fear as the bombing increased. We went out of the house and the shells fell around us. Some were killed and others were injured. We miraculously survived from that horrific night.
But changing location hasn't stopped the terror of nightly Israeli raids. And while the UN maintains the buildings, basic services are lacking, such as water and electricity. Food supplies are also said to be low.
What is happening is a massacre against the people, and it should not happen. We hope all countries of the world will stand with us and support us. Our children have psychological problems and live in terrible times.
The Palestinian Ministry of Health has also warned of an catastrophe outbreak of COVID-19, as overcrowding makes infections almost certain to soar.
We have 38,000 displaced people in about 48 schools spread over the various areas of the Gaza Strip. The conditions here are very difficult. These people left everything behind. Some of them came with bare feet. UNRWA is now fully managing these shelters. We try to provide families with sanitary supplies to help prevent the spread of COVID-19.
Palestinians were handed a lifeline by Egypt, which has opened its border with Gaza, and some humanitarian aid is making it through. But there is fears it won't be enough and the misery caused by a first week of fighting will only worsen. Palestinians see a glimmer of hope after Egypt opened its border with Gaza, allowing medical supplies and some humanitarian aid, which may help in improving the humanitarian catastrophe that afflicted the Gaza Strip this week. Nur Harazin, CGTN, Gaza.
So Egypt has opened its border with the Gaza Strip to evacuate injured Palestinians. Ambulances drove through the Rafah crossing on Monday, transferring 2 seriously injured people to Egypt for treatment. Cairo sent more than a dozen ambulances to pick up casualties, most of whom suffered serious injuries. Medical teams are reportedly also at the border crossing, triaging casualties as they arrive and allocating them to 3 designated hospitals. The United Nations Security Council is set to hold another emergency meeting on Tuesday about this conflict after the United States once again blocked a statement urging a halt to the violence. But the U.S. president did voice his support for a ceasefire in a call with Israel's prime minister. The Biden administration, meanwhile, has reportedly approved the sale of over $700 million worth of weapons to Israel. Nathan King reports.
Yes, another phone call between US President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Essentially more of the same, although he did mention the C word, ceasefire. Let me just read you out the salient points. Essentially he said he welcomed efforts to address violence, especially intercommunal violence within Israel's border. He encouraged Israel to protect civilians. As we know, the death toll has been extremely one-sided, with far more children and women dying in Gaza, and also support for a ceasefire, and will keep in touch. It sort of echoes an earlier call between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Israeli counterpart, in which they talked about negotiating, but really, essentially, the Biden phone call and the Secretary of State essentially asking for updates on how the operation, Israeli operation, is going against Hamas, essentially allowing Israel to continue. This, of course, follows a deadlock at the UN Security Council once again, the US blocking even a statement from the Council. We understand that it did not point the fingers squarely at Hamas. They did not want that. There was also, of course, talk of a two-state solution and the borders of 1967 for Palestine and Israel living side by side. These are two issues. While the US administration still clings to a two-state solution, we know that is not the policy of the current government in Israel of Benjamin Netanyahu. Also, the US is the main weapons supplier, as we know, to Israel, and green-lighted fast about $750 million in upscale weapons, including missiles. That has been noted around the world and criticized by quite a few countries. China, of course, which holds the rotating presidency of the Security Council this month, did release what it could be a statement, and was agreed to by other powers, which essentially asked the US to step up and stop blocking things at the United Nations. Remember, the US government has said that human rights would be a centerpiece of its foreign policy, and it's getting more and more criticism from around the world. Now, on the word of ceasefire, we know that the US has an emissary in the region, but negotiating essentially in Ramallah, where the Palestinian Authority are, not with Hamas, because they consider it a terrorist organization. The European Union are involved, France is involved, Egypt. They did have connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, of course, Hamas is an offshoot, but it's a different government now. We also have the United Arab Emirates, Qataris involved, but it does seem that a ceasefire is a long way off. And if we look at previous wars between Israel and Gaza and Hamas and Gaza, they have gone on a long time with mounting casualties. But this time, I can tell you, within the Democratic Party, within Washington, with the American public, there is a very different feeling. That the Palestinians here are definitely suffering far more than the Israelis, and there is more and more pressure here in the US for something to happen to stop the violence. Nathan King, CGTN, Washington.
And people around the world have been protesting Israel's strikes on Gaza. From Turkey to Yemen, people rallied in support of the Palestinian people. Tens of thousands marched in the streets of Yemen's capital, Sana'a. A few hundred demonstrators gathered near the Israeli embassy in Argentina's capital, Buenos Aires. Thousands also marched in the streets of American cities like Chicago on Sunday, supporting the Palestinians. In Jordan, hundreds gathered near Israel's embassy in Amman on Monday, demanding authorities deport the Israeli ambassador and close the embassy. Various groups also staged a rally outside the U.S. embassy in Indonesia's capital, Jakarta. Well, for more on this, let's bring in Woofu. He joins us now in the studio. He's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. It's good to have you with us on the show. So President Biden's now openly saying he does support a ceasefire in a telephone call with the Israeli Prime Minister, but he also makes it clear that Israel has a right to defend itself from attack. So what is the message, do you think, to Israel?
I think first, when, the conflicts broke out, the U.S. President has made very clearly he supported Israel, and he said Israel has the right to defend itself. But we also see, as the increasing of casualties, especially among the Palestinians, there is also pressure was built up on the Biden administrations, even within his own administration. And some people say that the U.S., especially the John Biden, promoting a kind of idea of human rights and democracies, but at the same time he was supporting the Israeli, to some extent, the killing the Palestinian people. I saw with the pressure was built up, he said he support the ceasefire. It sounds something like a change of the positions. This is, I personally believe, is a sound to pressurizing the Israeli governments, especially the Netanyahu governments. So, the time is come and enough is enough. Let's, seriously considered, the idea of ceasefire.
Enough is enough. Let's consider a ceasefire, but how likely do you think that is, since the Israelis have really given no indication that they're open to one right now?
But usually, this kind of a fighting would last for sometimes, 1 week is short. Usually, 2 or 3 weeks.
In 2014, it was 50
yes,
days.
And so 15 days, So I personally believe, since the Israel has bombed or destroyed most of visible targets of Hamas, I don't believe there is much left for the Israeli to bomb out. Now the time is how Israeli at this time to make a proper safety arrangement with Hamas in order to extend the quiet border between Gaza and Israel. I think this is the priority now for the Israeli government.
As you mentioned, this is something that we see every few years or so. Generally, we also see universal condemnation from the Arab world, those countries aligning in their condemnation of Israel's attacks to Gaza. This year, it's slightly different here. Israel has normalized ties with several countries like Bahrain and the UAE. So do you think that we are seeing a split in the alignment among Arab countries? How does this affect the dynamic there?
I think that this is a good point. This is also reflect the weakness of the Arab world. And as a matter of fact, if we're looking back, this is not the first time. And the Arab countries, they have been divided. They have adopted different attitudes with regard to the Palestinian issues. And for the UAE, for example, they believe that Hamas is a branch of a brotherhood. And for them, the Hamas or Brotherhood are the same, are regarded as a terrorist groups. And from the very beginning, UAE blamed Hamas starting this violence. So obviously, they were not, to support Hamas, and they're afraid that, at the end of the fighting, Hamas would emerge as stronger. This is something they don't like to see. So, they adopted this very low profile, and they could not say against Hamas to support the Israeli into bombing the Palestinian people. So I believe, until the Arab countries united, it will be very difficult to unify the Arab world to form a consensus with regard to the Palestinian issue. This is one of the issues why the Palestinian issue has been lasted so long, until now has not solved yet.
All right, Woofu with the China Institute of International Studies. Great to have you with us. Thank you so much.